Discernment and judgment have never been more important, but that's also why an understanding of the tectonic plates of how things work is ever more important as well.
You've previously mentioned those who have a tinkering mindset, or maybe the ones who can get ahead or stay ahead of the game. Tell me what you mean by that and why that is an advantage.
What doesn't change is that search for what other people don't know. At the heart of being an investor is deviating from consensus and saying what everyone thinks is actually not the case. This trend that everyone thinks is about to roll over, it's actually going to accelerate. There are firms that say you need to understand the fundamentals first, because if you go half in fundamentals and half in AI, in a year's time, you'll be not ready for prime time on either of these fronts. Then there are firms that say, if you don't start using the tools now, the tools are going to get better. And where will you be a year from now? You'll be watching the train disappearing away from you. So what's the right way? What I would say is this.
Is stock picking easier or more difficult in today's day and age, given the seemingly limitless information and data available? Or is it actually more about picking the right information to use? My conversation today is with Andrew Carr, head of enterprise training at Fundamental Edge, an analyst training firm that uses cutting-edge AI and years of industry knowledge to create and simulate a realistic state of investing for junior, mid-level, and senior talent. We discussed that the keys to being an analyst is really about using the tools to get the right information and articulating presentations and proposals with discernment and effective punchiness. Andrew, thank you for being here. So great seeing you today.
Likewise, great to see you. Great to be here. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. So, why is being an analyst today different than it was as recently as perhaps even 2023 or 2024?
Well, the answer won't come as a huge surprise. Obviously, AI is much more at the forefront and is raising a lot of questions about what the future of investment research looks like. What does an analyst day-to-day look like in the year 2030 is a question that's on analysts, PMs, and CIOs' minds. Incidentally, Brett and I did a webinar on breaking in about 2 years ago, and if we were to record it this morning, certainly AI would occupy a much more prominent place. Now, it's a little bit nuanced in terms of the incorporation of AI into investment research workflows. It's not a binary, it's a spectrum. There are going to be workflows that you can augment with AI, and then there are some that are kind of red light, don't touch them, don't involve AI, you'll do worse than if by chance. And so it's a bit of a tricky thing now where juniors are confronted with, on the one hand, the benefit of collapsing technological barriers to standing up AI, but then what's also laid bare is that a junior is still early in their career and may lack the kind of discernment and judgment that accompanies years of reps and experience that ordinarily would have been developed alongside that technical ramp that they would have had to have done through doing tons of models, tons of company write-ups, earnings previews, and the rest. So the discernment and judgment have never been more important, but that's also why an understanding of the tectonic plates of how things work is ever more important as well.
So tell me about how that technology is being incorporated. Obviously, the technology itself has improved, right? The large language models, the access to those models, the volume of those models.
Yep.
Those, you've previously mentioned those who have, and I'll quote, a tinkering mindset, right? Or maybe the ones who can get ahead or stay ahead of the game. Tell me what you mean by that and why that is an advantage.
Sure. I think it comes down to a fundamental truth that should be familiar to anybody in the hedge fund industry, which is the requirement of hustling. If you think back to the 80s with somebody counting cars on a parking lot and sprinting to a payphone to inform a member of their team in a timely manner, they were hustling. Somebody who's finding satellite photos or new sources of satellite photos that pop out of an LLM output is also hustling. What doesn't change is that search for what other people don't know. Now, what's kind of interesting is in the world of investment research, what you see in an LLM, it's a little bit like a Plato's cave problem where what you're not seeing is reality. What you're seeing is a web scrape of, call it 85% of what's out on the internet. However, in an industry where people are expected to know their companies better than 95% of market participants, oftentimes people know when the corpus is missing something key. And so there are people who say, well, wait a minute, I know more about this company than ChatGPT does. I mean, give me a break. Because what they know was accumulated over years of management meetings, years of interactions, years of following the company. So what's changing? I would say a few things. Thinking about risk is a little bit different. For instance, historically, if someone said, take a look at the stock and let me know what you think, a question pretty familiar to early career analysts, they may start with the industry, They may start with how the company makes money. What are the unit economics? They may get a model together. They may start to think about what the key drivers of the company are. And then they get to their part where they ramp on management, and then they learn that the CFO has never worked at a company that has gone 5 years without fraud allegations or worse. You can't get that time back that you spent on the industry. You can't get back that time you spent on unit economics. And if you're in, for instance, a generalist seat, if you had a hopper of 20 names you were trying to work through, it might be worth your time to think about the yellow and red flags that you have for companies and then say, hey, before I sharpen my pencil on anything about this company, can I just check that nothing is throwing out yellow or red flags that are going to cause me to shelve this project? So that's one way in which things are changing. What you care about doesn't change. What's a yellow or red flag for you doesn't change at all. But the ability to surface that sooner from unstructured data, that's something worth paying attention to.
I think it's also important, if I'm reading between the lines of what you're saying as well, like, yes, old school tenets in financial services of hustling, of course, those don't go away. And trying to be, at the cutting edge, of course, that doesn't go away. But at the same time, decisioning, right, and driving your decision making, that also remains a fundamental part of the process, right? As far as being somebody who is iterative or is as well informed as possible to drive your decision making, obviously with large scale revenue numbers and profit on the other side of these decisions. That also, technology has impacted that, but as far as a core fundamental, that hasn't changed either.
It's an interesting point that you raise because it's never been easier for a neophyte to the world of stock market investing, professional stock market investing, to pop out a report that looks, maybe like an extra on a TV set. The report is walking around with a lab coat and a clipboard and is completely empty. And there's no expertise behind it. And so one thing we say is, don't let your enthusiasm to express a view on a stock get in front of the work required to defend the statements that you're making. It's never been easier to pop out a company overview, with some trailing historicals and maybe some kind of tepid forecast about the future. Tepid not relating to the degree of what's expected, but just something that's something that's kind of uncontroversial. But at the heart of being an investor is deviating from consensus and saying what everyone thinks is actually not the case. This trend that everyone thinks is about to roll over, it's actually going to accelerate. This thing that everyone thinks is done, it's actually back. And so you can get to the first step very quickly. You can shrink your time to consensus remarkably quickly, much more quickly than you ever could before. The problem is you don't get paid on consensus. And so the decisioning aspect of it, going deeper, being able to defend things, it's not as simple as just one-shotting something. If you were to go into an LLM and say, right, is, company ABC a good company? You'll get, yes, it is a good company. They have revenues of this much and margins of that much, and the management has talked about the prospects. And then watch what happens if you say wrong. It'll say, oh, it's a bad company. Some of their customers have rolled off. There are growing concerns about whether the company is over-earning. And just like that, you're back to square one with all these data points, but nothing that's going to point you in the right direction. So the interesting thing here is actually, in the end, you have to kind of throw down the gauntlet and espouse a viewpoint that is not handed to you by the machine. The machine can organize information. In fact, an LLM can be a great thought partner or sparring partner. You can say, why would it not be the case that XYZ would happen? Give me 10 reasons. Maybe you as a person can come up with 4 or 5, but an LLM is, as kind of an engine that is set up to say something, can come up with a number of other considerations that you might not have thought of. Now, what you're not going to know is which one of these matter. That's kind of hard to know. Your PM may not even know with 100% precision which of these will matter. However, it's a good starting point where you can kind of crisp up your research. The big caveat is, more than ever, you need to understand what your team is looking for and what your team cares about. Because suppose you fall down the rabbit hole of figuring out the trajectory of tax rate for a company you're looking at. I've looked at a lot of companies. Rarely, if ever, has tax rate been deterministic of the direction of travel of the stock. But the LLM's not going to say, wait a minute, don't you think you should spend your time on something more useful? It'll say, well, let's dig into the geographic exposure and the various regulatory changes underway. And so you'll have this illusion you'll have this sense that you're doing something, that you're achieving something, but you're actually pulling yourself further and further away from what matters for the stock, and then kind of tacitly wasting time that you could have spent on what matters.
I find that to be so interesting because if you really boil it down, what you're saying is work smarter, not harder. But you could be working harder thinking you're working smarter because the model that you're using, as you say, as a sparring partner, isn't actually, that's not the human that has that implicit knowledge of how these things actually work. That said, curiosity, as you've alluded to, right? Curiosity amongst analysts, amongst those who are making decisions, is still absolutely important, whether it's with regards to applying new ideas, educating yourself, applying frameworks. Talk more about that. Talk more about why curiosity is still important, but kind of making sure that you're using it the right way rather than getting lost in those myriad rabbit holes as you referred to.
It's a tricky one to navigate because there have been a lot of situations where I've been in one seat or one industry or career or another where people say, you need to think about it the right way. Use your brain, think about it. And I thought, well, I did think about it, and this is the output. Telling me to think about it twice is not going to surface it. Like, I'm okay if you say, here's what I'm focused on, and we can both agree that this does not fix the rest of the questions that I'm ever going to have, but at least we can get to something that's a little bit more workable, in the moment. And so with curiosity, it's kind of, and by the way, I would add, this is kind of a tricky thing for juniors these days because juniors probably use ChatGPT a bunch during college. So they arrive at a fund and the fund says, you're the AI person. Well, what they are is somebody who is pretty up the curve in terms of using the tools, but not for this novel use case of investing, let's say. And so that can be, a storm brewing because you've given somebody who doesn't fully know how to drive, you've given them the keys to the Ferrari, and now they're likelier to cause harm rather than to help. So it's a tricky thing because juniors get tasked with using AI, but they don't know what to focus on. If you go to a fund as a junior, so you might say, well, so, you've talked this much about AI. I don't know whether I'm supposed to use it or I'm supposed to not use it. Like, help me out here. I would say a few things, and this just comes from observations at Fundamental Edge, our interactions with different firms. There are firms that say you need to understand the fundamentals first, because if you go half in fundamentals and half in AI, in a year's time, you'll be not ready for prime time on either of these fronts. Then there are firms that say, if you don't start using the tools now, the tools are going to get better. And where will you be a year from now? You'll be watching the train disappearing away from you. So what's the right way? We defer to funds. We don't espouse a particular viewpoint there. But what I would say is this. If you're a junior, what's different now versus in the past is you need to know ways in which you can show value. If you think back to people using Excel macros, being facile with Excel macros doesn't make you a better investor. But what you can do is if you're on the team and you say, hey, I noticed there's this thing that we do kind of regularly, and we can shorten the time required to do this mechanically using macros. Here, I built something. Do you want to test it out and see how it works? You're adding value to your team. You're not overstepping. You're not, wrestling the steering wheel away from your PM saying, I'm driving the bus now. You're noticing, you're getting a sense of what's going on around you. And then you're thinking about ways in which you can add value.
Creating efficiencies.
Creating capacity is something that we try to instill in every junior that we interact with. We're just at the beginning, you're costing your firm money. You don't have to like it, but you cost your firm money because you're not generating P&L for the team. You're processing ideas. You then progress from being an idea processor to an idea generator to a money maker. That's when you start to be a net benefit to the team. But in that early stage, you need to just create capacity however you can. Listening to another conference while your PM is in a meeting, or finding some way, just asking someone on your team, hey, is there any project that's kind of been sitting on the shelf that I can help with? Having that attitude of just wanting to contribute, add value, and reduce the number of tasks in the hopper is kind of one of the best things you can do as a junior as you come up the ramp, both in understanding what investing is and understanding how you fit into how your team approaches investing.
So if we consider that chapter one of our conversation, and Andrew, I know you and I could probably get to 15, 16, 17 chapters today, but for the sake of our audience, we'll try and keep it to a little bit fewer than that. Let's triangulate all of that into something that you referenced briefly, but I think is as far as analysts are concerned, as far as applications into this world are concerned, stock picking, right?
Yeah.
Let's bring all of that we've just spoken about into the concept of stock picking, whether it's part of an interview process, part of an investment club application, whatever it might be. Why is stock picking still important? Yet, how has it evolved a little bit? And how can juniors and analysts stand out in their stock picking proposals and presentations these days?
It's a funny question. The ways in which juniors can stand out for stock picking now kind of resemble the ways that juniors have always been able to stand out for stock picking. Finding something that the street is missing, articulating why the street is missing it, and finding a way to articulate what the catalyst path is towards the resolution of that mispricing. So I'll give you an example. I was a judge at a stock pitch contest the other month, and one of the teams that went home with a prize was a team that was covering Birkenstock. And so the example that I'll give you here is, this is not investment advice. This is just to prove, illustrate
This is
a point.
anecdotal. Yes.
This is anecdotal. Do your own research. As this team did, what they did was they said, Birkenstock doesn't seem to have a demand problem. They have a supply problem. And you can say, oh yeah, tell me more. I've heard that one before. But then they said, look on secondary markets. These are not, the Birkenstocks on secondary markets are not trading at a meaningful discount to what you would buy them for at the store, which suggests that there is some expansion possible of Birkenstock manufacturing capacity where they could still get a decent price for the shoes. Okay, fine. Let's accept that premise as temporarily true. Then they move on, and then they say, by the way, Birkenstock recently put out a release saying that they need a plant manager. So this suggests that they are going to open another manufacturing plant. And we went back and we looked, and every time one of these posts has gone out, that has preceded the opening of a factory by between 6 and 9 months. If this proposed factory were to come online within that historically observed timeline, it would imply this amount of incremental capacity and that amount of incremental revenue, where, as you can see here, sell-side consensus does not factor in the contribution of this new factory, which is why we think we have something here. Well, that wasn't really AI, but that laid out a very clean point of, here is what we believe to be the case. Here is some work that we have done. Here's what we have uncovered. And when we compare kind of where the chips fell in our research process to what is currently embedded in the stock, we think we actually have a delta here. And so it was a neat way to make this articulation. Now, could AI have helped on this? Sure. Could you stand up a scraper? Could you use the Wayback Machine? There are all sorts of things you could do to find that. But in the end, what they did was they said, here is the current price and what you would have to believe to be true with the current price. And here's what we think is actually happening. And this is the price that would be reflective of that happening. And so it comes down, it seems like a big round trip, but in the end, you're supposed to harness the AI as a tool. You're not substituting it for your own judgment. Having Microsoft Excel doesn't tell you what to put in Excel. It's a thing that you can use to express a viewpoint quantitatively.
So, keyword there, articulate, right? In this example, summary that you've just given, sounds like they might be onto something kind of besides the point, but the articulation of the point,
yes,
right or wrong, is what's most important. And in an age where communication and critical thinking remain one of the most sought after skills, regardless of your technical skills, that part's really crucial. And again, you are summarizing that presentation, but in articulation, right, there are steps to this process.
Yes, absolutely.
We talked about get your information, make your point, make sure it's deliverable in a way that can be received, right? Because in the real world, if you're presenting this to a portfolio manager who has a million things going on, who may not be the warmest, fuzziest type of audience, that articulation is absolutely critical. Talk a little bit more about the steps of just being quick, being punchy, and why that is so important.
I'd be happy to. For those who are watching from New York, you might be familiar with a newspaper called the New York Post. Never once in my life have I seen a headline in the New York Post and been utterly bewildered about what the story's about. They get it all out instantly. If you want to read more, you can read into the article. So the first thing is, put your pitch as a New York Post headline, such that, imagine you were in an elevator with some of the titans of investing at some conference. You've got like 15 seconds as the elevator goes down. What can you do that will make somebody hear it, pause, and then ping somebody on their team to do a little bit of more work. Oh, I heard there was a long pitch, something about this factory, and that's not in numbers. That kind of thing is so important. And one of the tricky things for early career analysts is they want to establish the robustness of the work that they've done. And they think that the best way to do that is to show the work they've done and then build up to the grand reveal at the end. It just doesn't work that way in investing. You do the New York Post headline first, and the body of work that you've done is going to come in handy because you could be asked about any of the statements, any premise that you're asserting in your pitch. You're going to want to have robust, defensible backups for it, but engage in that in Q&A. Get the point out first, and then be ready for any other thing that may come back. There was a thing, I did a thing on YouTube about this where, I started and then did the grand reveal at the end. People were like, why don't you do the headline at the front like you say you're supposed to do? Well, the answer is, if people knew to do that, then they wouldn't be watching this. You got to meet them where they are and then show the target behavior so that, and this is a lot of what I do. I hear people's stock pitches and I say, okay, I'm going to remix your pitch and I'm going to articulate it in a way that's a lot more punchy. And so oftentimes people have actually put the pieces of a watch out on a table, but they don't have a watch. They haven't organized them into something that's useful. And the unit of work for a PM is a usable, actionable idea. So you start with the action, what the percent move is, what the risk reward is, what the thesis points are that lay bare what the market is missing. If you're pitching Ford long or short, the mispricing is not that people don't know that Ford makes cars. It's got to be something else in expectations. So you want to talk about how future expectations are going to change. And that's where you can do the most work. AI is really good at giving you a laundry list of things that you can do to answer a question. AI is not presently at a stage where you can get what the question is. That's the discernment and judgment. But if you wanted to say, hey, how would I figure out if sales are trending better or worse at this company? An LLM is not too bad at coming up with a laundry list of the sorts of things that you might do. The AI can't, well, there are exceptions that apply, but AI can't make calls on your behalf. There actually are companies that do that now. But knowing what matters is critical, and communicating what matters is vital to your PM's understanding of, number one, does this person understand what matters? And two, is this person a good communicator? It's not something that we talked about this morning, but anyone who's looking to work at a fund, you may think, oh, I have the world's greatest pitch. You go to a fund, the fund says, it's not for us. And then you may think, I'm doomed. This is it. I spoke to a real life investor and they don't like my pitch. That's the end. And then that afternoon, they bring the same pitch to an interview and people say, this resonates. And I think the point to make is what makes markets is a heterogeneity of market participants. And so if you're thinking about where you want to work, it's not just, can you do the technical elements of the job? Those are how you get a conversation, how you advance to the case study, how you fare in the case study. A lot of that is really just comparing your analytical and communication style to what the fund does for compatibility. They don't need a chameleon. You don't need to become a chameleon, but what you need to do is understand what it is that they look for and see if that's the kind of thing that you would be comfortable doing for the job, under duress and under time constraints. So the compatibility with the analytical and communication style with the fund are paramount. If you don't know how the fund does things, you can't go wrong by starting with the New York Post headline test.
If anybody takes anything away from the conversation that we have today, I think that bit that you just said is the most important. It's critical information for anyone trying to join the industry. That's really helpful stuff. We've talked a little bit about the technical capabilities and the technology driving those technical capabilities. One of my last questions for you is these candidates that we're talking about, these existing employees, aspiring analysts, current analysts, junior analysts, whatever they may be. Is there such thing in this day and age as your traditional fundamental analyst? Or because everything is moving in such a technical type of way, where even the employees in traditional finance type of roles, revenue generating, investment banking type roles as well, even where they are so large language model literate and AI literate, is everyone just a data scientist now, or some form of a data analyst, or is there still such thing as a traditional financial analyst?
The role of financial analyst still exists. What your day-to-day looks like is going to be a little bit different. By the way, you could say the same about the the advent of factors in terms of performance attribution and thinking about portfolio exposures. It used to be you would find mispriced ideas and put them on, and then all of a sudden it turns out that your entire portfolio is bets on four different wheels of effectively the same car. And so you may have what look like idiosyncratic ideas, but you're taking a very big exposure, knowingly or unknowingly, with this particular combination. When you think about being a fundamental equity analyst, something that you want to think about is, what is the point that I'm making? What is the market missing? And then how do I substantiate that? And also, I think the importance of this doesn't come up as much as I think it should. A position can really only help or hurt the portfolio once it's on. You can argue till you're blue in the face about whether a pitch has merit or not. But once that pitch is live, that's when it can really swing around the portfolio's performance. And this is where the fun really begins. Understanding how to monitor whether something is tracking. And new analysts, if you did everything by LLM only, we can all agree it would be pretty ridiculous if you were to watch a boxing match and you were to place a huge bet that one of the boxers isn't going to get hit once during the entire match. That sounds a little bit ridiculous. You know that there will be a winner declared at the end of the match. The same is true with stocks. It's messy. There will be headlines that are good for your stock, headlines that are bad for your stock. You, as an analyst, need to be a difference engine. You need to gauge the materiality. What does this do to numbers? Is this an echo of something that everyone already gets, or is this something new? And by the way, the loudest voice doesn't necessarily mean it's the most informative. It could be a blog post that could knock 20% off of a stock. So you have to be open to that. To your question about being a data scientist, certainly people are going to need to get a lot, number one, more creative about where they find data to monitor theses. Why? Because they're going up against people who are very high agency, who have been in the markets for years, who have this long list of things that they would do if they had 5 more hours in a day, who, thanks to agentic workflows, have 5 more hours in a day. And they have little clones of themselves running around the internet and the market. So one is getting a little bit more creative and ability to triage the importance of things. It's very interesting because back in the day, you may not think about being a data scientist, but if you wanted to track something, you might have to fill out a form, get in touch with the data science team, clarify your requirements. The team would triage it relative to the other items that they're working on. Maybe the scraper would be built. You would then do, user acceptance testing, and then you would have something. It's borderline magical that building these kinds of scrapers is easier than it's ever been, because then you just need to have the clarity of mind of what it is that you're looking for and the ability to articulate what you're doing. And there isn't this iterative conversation. You can stand up a prototype that gets you most of the way there. It's not a substitute for a fully vetted thing. Of course, vibe-coded things are subject to decay, of course. But to do a first cut of something or a first pass of something has never been easier, which means that the discernment or judgment to know what matters or what kind of data could move the needle has never been more important.
There are those words again: articulation, discernment. It's so obvious how important those are. So, okay, that's all. It's all so helpful. I think it's really insightful. What I want to close with actually is for you to tell me a little bit more about fundamental edge and why those candidates or employees, as we've referred to various demographics here today, why should candidates use fundamental edge and maybe potentially Selby Jennings candidates, those that we're dealing with on a regular basis, those who might be listening to this podcast, why should aspiring analyst candidates use fundamental edge, and potentially why should their clients recommend their analysts to you as well, obviously as a way to better their employees, their existing employees?
Well, we defer to people's individual judgment. Our highest and most noble purpose is to do what we say on the can, and then, we leave it to people to arrive at their own conclusion. But something that should give people a little bit of confidence in learning about fundamental investing from Fundamental Edge Analyst Academy is 2/3 of people who go through Analyst Academy are actually already on the buy side somewhere. And they are rounding out the kind of training that they've gotten. They realize it's kind of an apprenticeship business, and they realize that the treadmill keeps on increasing the angle of incline as time goes on. And so they just want to get an articulated, structured breakdown of what an investment process looks like. Now, it's not my process. It's not our founder, Brett Karin's process. What we communicate is what has currency out in the market, so that you're not, we're not selling somebody else's shoes and then say, go out there in the world. What we're doing is saying these are the kinds of things that are out there in the markets that have currency. And these are the kinds of analytical frameworks that make sense to people. So you don't need to reinvent the wheel. Maybe some summary stats. We've had about 1,500 people go through Analyst Academy, 2/3 on the buy side. And a good number of those actually are sponsored by their firms, because the firms say the PM does not have the time to articulate every single thing that they do. The PM just wants to say, do laundry, not get the clothes, separate by fabric type, exclude those that go to dry cleaning, and the rest of it. They just want you to complete the action. So what we break down is kind of when a PM is saying this, these are the kinds of things that you should do. In terms of employers who are looking for people, we've been proud to learn that there have been a couple of like jump ball situations where that somebody had completed Analyst Academy, got them a second look, and then they wound up securing an offer. And even one of my old PMs has spoken with a lot of people coming out of Analyst Academy, and he has high standards, as any PM would, and commented that they do stand apart from a lot of the candidates that he's historically seen. Certainly the bar for preparation goes ever higher. Having a clear, structured articulation of what it takes to be out there. The difference is, we talk about how the how is changing with technology, but the why is unchanged. Stocks become mispriced for kind of the same reasons, regardless of the technology that's out there. And just like you wouldn't say, here's your GPS or here's your compass, go from whatever 58th and 7th down to 43rd and 3rd. People can ultimately make their way there, but they may not think, oh, how far south is that? How far east is that? They still need to know northeast, southwest. They still need to know how you get from point A to point B. And there are a lot of these basic things that don't go away with technology. The technology is built on these tectonic plates of how markets function. And so understanding the underlying logic behind them is going to help you make better use of technology, as opposed to mimicry of mimicry of mimicry, which if you go down that route, I don't think you're going to outcompete an LLM at that.
Incredibly helpful. And I think there's a lot to be gained, as you've just proven. But also, the one humble bit that you're not saying is that Fundamental Edge is also by analysts for analysts, right? So you are all ex-industry.
That out, yes.
So there are a lot of benefits that can be made for those applying and those who are looking to level themselves up. So thank you again. Just some incredible insights and real value add for anyone who is just looking to level themselves up in any kind of analyst capacity in the modern age. So even if they don't apply to Fundamental Edge, in this short conversation, there are some really useful nuggets of information. So thanks again for being here, Andrew. 非常谢. And I will speak to you again soon.
We'll pick it back up sometime soon. For those who are interested in getting in touch with Fundamental Edge, a quick thing, you can purchase Fundamental Edge Analyst Academy. Application is not required. If you have any other questions, feel free to drop me an email at andrew@fundamentedge.com, not fundamentaledge.com. It will not go to us. andrew@fundamentedge.com or info@fundamentedge.com. Barring that, we've done a lot on AI recently. If you're interested in seeing the kinds of things that we've been doing, you can take a look over at our YouTube channel, where Brett recently, in the last month, did 4 webinars on the ways in which agentic AI is changing the investment process. Thank you very much for the time today. It was a great conversation. I had a lot of fun. I appreciate your thoughtful questions.
Talk to you soon, Andrew. That's all for today's episode of Searching Smarter. If you found this conversation valuable, be sure to subscribe so you don't miss an episode. Until next time, keep searching smarter.